Treena Huang is an expert in transforming team cultures towards higher performance and trust. As a highly sought after coach, Trina's unique live 360 feedback approach trains the skills necessary to communicate with both candor and kindness. Before becoming a leadership coach, Trina served as a UN official working in high stakes political settings. The world could probably use some of that today. She has advised senior government officials, the executive masthead of the New York Times, tech founders, and C suite leaders in the nonprofit sector. Treena, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Mike.
Yeah, really
Great to
looking
be
forward
here.
to this. And the first question I always ask, after all, this is the Better Leadership Team show, is from all of your experience, what do you believe is the one most important characteristic of a great leadership team?
Mm. I think the extent to which teens can be great is a direct reflection of how good they are at being able to tolerate uncomfortable conversation.
Love that answer because I see that all over the board in my leadership teams. And my sense is, as we talk about feedback today, our topic, there are a lot of potential uncomfortable conversations there. So can't wait to dive into that with you. And I certainly I want to spend a good amount of time on your specific live 360 feedback approach. But before we do, I want to be a little bit more basic and foundational. As leaders, why is feedback so important? And do we get enough of it or do we not get enough of it?
Feedback is the only way that we ever know how we're doing, right? I mean, we can be out there in the world and think we're doing a great job. But unless we're actually hearing that reflected back to us from the people that work most closely with us, we actually don't know. And the reality is that we can't see ourselves. We have blind spots, we have things we're not aware of. And so, how we're doing in anything in life, but particularly in our jobs, is really influenced by how much feedback we get. And I think that you asking the question, you already know from your own experience, we absolutely don't get enough of it. It's a conversation that everybody avoids. We do it because HR tells us we have to do it. We work in an organization that has processes and systems, and we need to fit into those. So we will fill out the forms, we will go along with the process and do as little as we can to comply with what's required. But the extent to which the quality of that conversation is really going to be impactful for the person and for the team they're working in is doubtful. And we know this because we have so many problems with not only performance, but things like people skipping work, people not being engaged, people just checking out or dialing it in, people starting to have problems getting along with each other because there are things that are not being said or being talked about behind people's backs. And this is just all the stuff that happens when we can't just have candid conversations with each other and be open to how we ourselves can improve our own experience.
So diving in a little deeper on that, I think from the leaders that I work with, I think people have a hard time both giving feedback and also in the right ways to receive feedback. So I want to talk about a little bit of both, but let's start with giving feedback. Why does that seem so much harder than it should be? Why is it difficult for some leaders to give each other feedback or, why is giving feedback so hard?
I think that you hit the nail on the head pointing out these two roles that we have in that feedback exchange. To give it is typically where we focus. We invest a lot in managers in figuring out what to say, how to say it, what order to say things in. But at the heart of the feedback conversation is actually how difficult it is to hear it. So this idea of receiving feedback. And so when we're in a position of having to tell someone, what we really think or how they might improve, we're very aware of not wanting to be disrespectful or maybe hit something that might bring about a really angry or defensive response. And we don't want to be in a position of having to be on the receiving end of that. We don't know how to be in that. So we're looking at ways to avoid that reaction.
What are some of the characteristics of, and again, let's talk about the giving side. What are some of
Yeah.
the characteristics of great feedback? How should people think about it? And maybe part of that is if we understand the characteristics of giving great feedback, maybe we will be more likely to do it because we'll be less likely for that to turn into a difficult, uncomfortable situation. So, what are some of the characteristics of giving great feedback?
I think it really starts with checking in with what your intention is before you actually give the feedback. Is your intention to correct that person, make that person better, put them in their place, uh, exert your own kind of control or your own influence as a manager, because it's your job to do? Or is it that you really want to offer them something that can be genuinely helpful to them professionally in their own personal growth? And the reason why I think that piece is so important is because there's a felt sense to it. When someone tells us something that's hard to hear, it's not so much the content that we will object to, it's the way in which it makes us feel. So when people feel that you care about them, that you respect them, that you see their effort, their goodness, it really serves to heighten the likelihood that they're going to stay in the conversation and be willing to open up to that. So I think that's at the heart of it all, and often the piece that we skip.
Yeah, I love that. And I'll paraphrase what I'm hearing is we need to see the other person as a person, not as an obstacle in the way to getting the job done. And I'm so focused on that. I'm rereading for about the sixth time a great book called Leadership and Self Deception. I don't know if you've ever read that. If you haven't, and I'm talking to both Treena and
Oh.
the audience as I say that, amazing book to go read. But it sounds like it starts with seeing the other person as a person and also believing in their positive intent, believing they're trying to do the best they can versus what the hell is wrong with you.
Oh, that's such a good way to put it, Mike. That's absolutely it. I think it's the difference between focusing on what to say, doing it right, versus just making a connection with someone and being real and remembering that we're just people. We're just doing the best we can with what we know.
What about timing of feedback? And I have a good sense maybe the answer to my question is going to be, well, Mike, it's both, but you'll give me a little more color commentary than that is, you know, feedback in the moment versus more overall, here's how you're doing kind of feedback, and here are some things I'd like you to change. Is there a secret
Mm.
formula to that mix? Should it all be in the moment? Are there times when in the moment doesn't make sense? How should we be thinking about that?
I think there's different kinds of feedback, right? There's the in the moment feedback where something had the opportunity to be corrected. And I think generally, the more we can do that kind of regular, consistent way of communicating with each other, the better off we all are because we give ourselves the opportunity to actually improve something, correct something, change something. Whereas if we leave it to 6 months when we actually have the formal performance appraisal conversation, it's too late. And that person has lost out on the opportunity to even try to address it. Having said that, I think, you know, there is reason to having a timetable around those more formal conversations that typically address career growth, development opportunities, and checking in with a person about how they're really feeling about their job, how they're doing, the things they want to learn, the things they want to share that maybe there isn't so much time for in the day to day.
So we talked about some of the characteristics of giving feedback. I think people underestimate that there's a skill to receiving the feedback as well. So what have you seen? What mistakes have you seen people make in receiving feedback? And what are some of the characteristics that or best practices around receiving feedback?
Well, I think you touched on it, in your book recommendation, this idea of self-deception. We're all kind of doing that. We're all sort of deluding ourselves in a way, trying to cover over the aspects of ourselves that we're hoping people don't see. We know when we're not doing a great job. We know when we're not great at something, but it's hard to be open about that. And so I think, as a feedback receiver, the more open we can be to acknowledging those growth areas in ourselves, the more willing we can be to say, hey, that's true. That is something I could see being something I could work on. I'm willing to try that. I think that curiosity, that willingness to take what someone is offering us and trying it on. It's a shortcut, actually. It's a shortcut to be able to solve a lot of our own problems because we don't have to figure out how to do it. We can just take, the recommendation that someone's offering us. And I think that takes a certain level of humility, right? For us to be that self-honest with ourselves. But actually, it's something that can benefit us, not just at work, but more generally, in all of our relationships. So, as a receiver, openness, curiosity, and the ability to take it in without it meaning something about our worth or our goodness. I think that's the real key.
What if we disagree with the feedback somebody gives us?
Mm, yeah, I love that. And often that's the case. The way somebody else sees our work or sees us doesn't feel lined up with how we see ourselves. I think it's important to be able to express that and say, can you tell me more about that? I'm not sure I agree with that. Or can I share with you my experience of this? And letting that person see your interpretation, your perspective, not as a defensive, argumentative response, but one that actually deepens the understanding
I
between the
like
two.
that. And what I often coach leaders to do is whether you agree with the feedback or not, thank the other person and not thank you
Mm,
for that, like not a
absolutely.
sarcastic thank you,
Right.
but thank them not necessarily because you agree with the feedback, but thank them for being courageous enough and caring enough to give you
Absolutely.
that feedback, whether you agree with it or not.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I think that's so key, and that actually is what kinda keeps us in the conversation, right? If we can kinda stay in that position of remembering that that person, has made the time and had the courage to tell you something that probably wasn't so comfortable for them, is what helps us to kind of stay in that more
Yeah, I think
open
it does that.
space.
It also makes the other person more likely to give us feedback again next time, as opposed to he always shuts me down.
Yep,
I'm just going to stop trying. So
absolutely.
tell us more. So we've talked about basics of giving and receiving feedback. Now I want to get into kind of your model, which I find fascinating, is this live 360 feedback. And I have done 360s before with my clients. Some of them work really well. There are some tools that work better than others because they don't hide anonymity very well, and therefore people don't necessarily write the way they feel. You've got a leader that says, "Oh, I know by the way that's written. I know who said that," and it can get ugly. So I've seen 360s done
Mhm.
really well. I've seen 360s done not so well. But I think your model is very different. So tell me a little bit more about the live 360 model.
Yeah. So, the traditional approach is as you described, it typically is written and people can generally tell, who the feedback is coming from, which kind of overrides the intention of anonymity, this idea that we shouldn't know who's writing things, that we should just take the feedback objectively. But That's really underestimating, I think, of the person who's receiving it, but it's also really underestimating the person giving it and their ability to communicate something in a way that opens up an opportunity for people to talk about something so that there can be that understanding. So the live aspect of it really is about people coming around a table and sharing directly with that person what their feedback is. And what that does is it holds them as feedback givers accountable to the feedback being true, that they can substantiate it, that they have examples. And because it's being shared in a group setting, it kind of amps up that accountability aspect. They're not going to come in and say something that's fueled by an argument they had with that person 2 days before. It's not going to be some kind of emotional outburst. It'll be something that actually is legitimate. And what happens in this kind of setting is that people learn to say and be in these uncomfortable spaces in the presence of their colleagues in a very supportive kind of way. And what ends up coming out is feedback that is generally pretty consistent across the group, which is always really interesting because if you're hearing the same thing from multiple people, you kind of know it's something you need to pay attention to. And so that's the power of what ends up coming through. Now it's not all just random, you can say anything. I do guide the session with 3 very specific questions. So they're all coming in prepared with their response to the same 3 questions. And during this time, the receiver, and this is pretty fundamental to the exercise, the receiver is silent. So they actually are just there to listen. They're just there to take it in, and they're spared, the need to say something or respond or explain themselves or argue. And it's a very fundamental part of what it means to be a good receiver, right? To be able to listen and not react right
What are
away.
those 3 questions?
So the 3 questions are really simple. The first one is, what's one thing I should do more of? What's one thing I should do less of or differently? And what's one thing you appreciate about working with me?
Love it.
So, they're wide open questions. You can answer them in any way. You can approach that in any way you want to. And I think what works well about those questions is that they're not really inherently positive or negative. More of something doesn't mean it's good. Less of something doesn't mean it's bad. They're actually very neutral questions. And it's one thing. So it's not a laundry list of 59 things, right? It's one thing. And so the things that come through are going to be the most impactful, hardest hitting behavioral changes that will have the greatest impact on that person and the people they work with.
So for folks, and maybe I should have asked this first, but that's okay. For folks that are less familiar with even what a 360 is, let alone the live, your version of it. 360, I mean, who are the folks, around the table? Is it just that person's direct reports? Is it direct reports, peers, and who they work for? Is it truly 360? Who's typically in the room?
So my guidance to them in choosing who they're going to have in the room, and this is an important part of the exercise. They get to choose. They choose who they're going to receive feedback from. And a lot of people, skeptics, will say, well, why should they be able to choose? They'll just choose people that are going to say positive things about them. Well, the guidelines around this are that you need to have your direct supervisor. So that is one person that has to be there. You need to have at least one direct report, somebody you manage. You need to have peers, people that are working in different functional units. And there's enough options in there to have a mix of different levels, different grades of authority. And I will ask this person, why they're choosing this list of people. And What's interesting is that if they've come to this exercise and decide they're gonna actually have the courage to do it, they're not gonna choose people that are only gonna tell them good things. They wanna hear the real stuff. So that's never been an
How do
issue.
you deal with so given that part of the 360 and part of most more traditional 360s do have that, that's what 360 means. It's, all around the person you're reporting to, the folks reporting to you, peers, etc. But as you said, the traditional version is that's all written. But now I'm picturing you're now in the room with, let's say, three of your direct reports, and your boss is in the room. What I
Mm.
find interesting, and I'd love to hear how this actually happens, is if I'm the person getting the 360, my direct reports are hearing what my boss is saying about me. So, two concerns I have there that I want to find out what it really looks like and how you deal with it. One is, man, I don't know if I want my direct reports hearing how the guy I'm reporting to or the woman I'm reporting to thinks I'm a screw up. I don't want my direct reports hearing that. But maybe
Mhm.
the bigger
Mhm.
concern in my mind is, what are the chances that my boss, in front of the people that work for me, that my boss is going to fear being open and honest because they want to be sensitive that my direct reports don't hear things that maybe they don't need to hear or shouldn't hear. How do you deal with that, and how does that actually play out?
I think those are really good points that come up in every 360 I do. Everybody brings up those concerns. I don't wanna make my boss look bad in front of her boss and vice versa. And actually, that's all part of it. It's to recognize that we have so much fear and concern over having to hide the truth. And because all of these participants are receiving some private coaching in the background, so, before we actually go into that room, I've already spent some time privately with each of the participants to be able to express some of these concerns or fears they have and to reassure them that actually, if your intention is really to help this person, it only benefits them to have everyone have a full view of how they're perceived. And not in a critical way, not in a shaming or embarrassing way, but in a way that's messaged around being in support of this person and having the confidence in them that they can be even better than they are. And so, it's this opportunity for your direct reports to see you as somebody who has the courage to go out there and be so vulnerable as a leader that shows your people, wow, like this person is serious, like my boss is serious about being able to take feedback and can do it in this really open way. And what that does, of course, is it brings about this self-reflection. Like, I'm asking my boss to do this thing. Like, am I doing that? And this is what starts kind of, creating this ripple effect in the exercise. That while it may be about that one person who's receiving the feedback, all of the people around the table who are giving it are actually also benefiting from their own self-reflection, from their discomfort around having to say something that's difficult. And when everybody kind of gets thrown into this mix of being really uncomfortable together, something kind of magical happens in allowing for more truth, more supportiveness and kindness to come through.
So let's talk about a little bit about that truth, because the word trust keeps popping up in my head, and I feel like it's
Mm.
the chicken or the egg here, and I want to get your thoughts. Is,
Yeah.
in order for this to work well, there needs to be, I imagine there needs to be some level of trust on the team because giving and receiving feedback, as we said, is not an easy thing to do. And if you don't trust the giver or the receiver, it's not going to work as well. So I imagine there's some level of trust that is needed for this to work well. And that's probably why you coach everybody a little bit beforehand. But then I also think just the act of doing this exercise builds trust. So that's why I'd say it's like the chicken or the egg. So talk a little bit more about the trust component and how that plays out.
Yeah, such a good point. When you think about human relationships, the only way we grow trust with each other is through difficult conversations. We don't just have trust with anybody, because we agree on everything and because everything is always pleasant and easy. We grow trust because we've been through something together. We've had a disagreement. We've worked something out. We've hurt each other, but been able to kind of come through that. And that's actually what keeps trust alive. It's what deepens our trust. It's what allows us to be ourselves with each other. So you're absolutely right. There has to be some level of trust in the team to introduce something like this, but the trust doesn't have to be that deep. It just has to be respectful. There has to be a baseline of respect between colleagues and a feeling that, yeah, I'm willing to come to this because I do want this person to be able to do better. I do want to help this person if there's something I can let them in on. But beyond that, there doesn't need to be anything more. And what the exercise does is it helps people to realize, wow, like that person could really hear that and they took it really well. And they value my perspective, and when that person goes out and actually applies their feedback, well, then that whole trust and respect, goes to another level because now I feel like you really care about my view. You respect what I think. And now I'm more open to what you might offer to me. And that's the kind of dynamic that we want to see more of in high performing
Yeah, and you're going to
teams.
get that at a deeper level by doing it live versus the traditional, I'm just looking at a report at the end of the day. What are the other what are some of the other benefits maybe we haven't talked about yet of this live 360 model versus the traditional one?
Well, I think, this comes back to your point about the receiver really being at the heart of whether or not feedback goes anywhere. You can be the best feedback giver and do really well at being able to communicate that. But if the person doesn't do anything with your feedback, it really doesn't mean a whole lot. So this exercise actually has a follow-up component. So within 3 to 4 months after the first round, we actually reconvene again. And we, you know, invite people to share, what have they noticed this person's done differently? What has the impact of those changes been? What are some examples that you noticed? And that really serves to reinforce and affirm that person's effort. But it also, again, it's engaging the people around you. So, you know, they're staying alive in not only being able to support you, but in remembering like what's relevant about the feedback you gave them. So that follow-up component is a strong, difference from the more traditional approach. The coaching aspect as well, that each person has a little bit of coaching around these sessions because feedback is it's not a natural communication skill. None of us really knows how to do it very well. And there are some very specific tips and ways of communicating things that people can practice and implement. I think the other aspect is probably just the transparency of it, because coming out of these rounds, the person who received the feedback actually emails out their commitment. So it's not just a conversation and everybody just walks away and feels good. That person actually thinks about how they're going to apply that feedback, and they put it in an email and they say, this is what I've heard. These are the ways I'm going to be applying it. And they give very specific contexts, situations where they're going to make that effort. so that those around them can actually watch, observe, is that person doing what they said they were going to? And it's that kind of baked in accountability that really makes it more likely that the feedback's going to be used.
And I think the fact that is like we always talk about 360s, the best tools, have this level of anonymity. But if you really get to the heart of what we're trying to do here, the anonymity is, I mean, that's kind of a bullshit part of the process. Like, why do we want
Totally.
anonymity? To me, I'm more likely to do something about it if someone gave me heartfelt feedback. I also think, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, but I want to put another kind of stamp on it because it's so important, is this in effect becomes a really important exercise in building the team and the trust of the team, which I don't think you get out of a traditional 360.
Yeah. No, thank you for saying that. It's so true, right? This anonymity thing, it's like because we don't trust ourselves to be able to have a mature professional conversation that we have to hide behind anonymity. Like that's just so dismissive of, you know, our capacity as humans, that we can't just learn to do that. And I think if we're really serious about growing our team culture, to work well together, to respect each other, to be supportive of each other, then we need to be able to, at the very least, show up for each other through these kinds of conversations.
Beautiful. I love the model. Is this something that you've got the session, then you've got the follow up? Is there a recommendation of, hey, this is something you ought to be doing every year, every 2 years, once in a blue moon? How often does this happen?
So I have teams that I've been working with actually for years where they've incorporated this as a regular ritual. They do it maybe each person does it once a year, but everybody on the team is doing it. So they're constantly participating either as a receiver or as a giver. And it becomes something that keeps the practice of uncomfortable, candid conversations alive. And it's incredible to see what happens in a very short time. People start to become really like at ease with it. It's no longer something that makes them nervous. Everybody goes into it kind of almost excited, like, oh, I wonder what they're going to say this year versus last year when I had it. And you see over time the way that people expand and grow in themselves. And it's really quite a moving experience because they're telling each other, a year ago when you did this, I remember this, and now I see you in a completely different space in yourself and you're so much more confident and they track with each other and they're witnesses to each other's development and growth and it's just the most moving and inspiring process to be a part of. So, for the companies that do this regularly, it has
I would
massive
also
impact.
imagine that because part of what you're doing here is not only ensuring everybody gets the feedback they need to grow, but you're building people's muscles around feeling comfortable giving and receiving feedback, which is part of what you just said. And I imagine what happens, and tell me if I'm right, is that while people may get the formal 360, periodically once a year, whatever it is, I would imagine people are much more comfortable and people are giving much more frequent informal feedback when they see it because now they're comfortable giving it.
That's it. That's the ultimate goal is that this just starts being a way of communicating with each other. It's no longer an event to do this. It's just a way of communicating and it really changes their level of trust and the way that teams work
Beautiful.
together.
So as we start to wrap this up, Trina, so this is, obviously we've talked all about feedback and the 360, but tell me a little bit about your coaching business. Is this the only thing you focus on? Are there other things you focus on? How else do you help your clients?
Mm. So this is my primary way of working with teams, but I'm also coaching people privately, both from the executive space and through companies that are sponsoring them. But I'm also working a lot with private individuals who are interested in their own growth and want a space where they can talk more openly about the private things that really matter to them. So those are really the three ways that I'm
And if
coaching these
people want to
people.
find out more about the Live 360 or just more about in general the kind of coaching you do, if they want to get in touch with you, where should they go?
They should go to my website, treenahuang.com. And as of very recently, they can also find me on Instagram. I'm at Coach with
And Huang
Treena.
is Huang for those
You got it.
you
You
know
got it. That's
dumb
right.
white people in the audience who don't know how to spell that kind of stuff. Did I just say
Or
something not? But maybe I'm not very woke. Anyway, this was great, Treena. Thank you so much. I always say if you want a great company, you need a great leadership team. Treena, thanks so much for helping us get there today.
Thank you so much, Mike. Really enjoyed it.
All right.